Story 1. The Midnight Parade. The Invitation. Every year on the 4th of July, Millfield transformed into a lively swirl of lights, laughter, and music. This little town, isolated from sprawling cities and massive crowds, loved its traditions. The celebration was more than just a parade, it was a coming together of families, friends, and neighbors who'd lived their whole lives intertwined. Flags draped over every window, the smell of barbecued meat filled the air, and children giggled, their faces painted with red, white, and blue. The tradition had gone on for as long as anyone could remember. The parade's crowning glory was the Grand Float, an enormous carriage decorated with a sprawling flag, drawn through the main street by a local farmer's finest horses. This year, however, felt different. There was a strange tension in the air. It was subtle, maybe a quiet murmur here, a nervous glance there, but people noticed it. The feeling took shape one morning when the townspeople awoke to find an invitation slipped beneath every door. It was not the usual printed flyer announcing parade timings and local performances. This invitation was handwritten on thick, old-fashioned parchment. The ink was dark, almost sticky, with a strange metallic sheen that caught the light in odd ways. The invitation read, "You are invited to Millfield's very first midnight parade. Join us for a night you'll never forget. See you at the town square at midnight on July 4th. No one knew where it came from, and no one had any idea who might be behind it. The handwriting was archaic, looping elegantly in a style that seemed to belong to a different era. A soft, sickly scent clung to the parchment, something like damp earth mixed with old leather. Each person held the invitation with a mix of curiosity and unease. Who would send this? Millfield wasn't the sort of town for mysteries, and no one had ever heard of a midnight parade. At first, people shrugged it off as a prank. Teenagers in Millfield were known for harmless tricks, and maybe this was just one of them. But as the day wore on, curiosity began to bloom. After all, Millfield hadn't had anything truly exciting happen in years. By the time the sun began to set, word of the mysterious invitation had spread through every corner of town, and the once dismissive attitudes had shifted to murmurs of excitement. A parade at midnight? Surely it was something new to see. The entire town began talking, wondering who might be organizing it and what the parade would look like. Speculation spiraled, and a strange mix of thrill and unease swirled through the crowd that gathered as evening fell. Despite their uncertainty, the townsfolk couldn't resist the pull of the invitation. After the usual July 4th festivities ended, the fireworks erupted, sending bright flashes of color exploding in the night sky. Yet, even as the children cheered and the adults clapped, eyes kept drifting toward the clock. As midnight approached, the excitement shifted, tinged now with a creeping tension. It felt as though everyone had a choice to make, to give in to the eerie pull of the midnight invitation or stay within the safety of their homes. Slowly, the crowd converged upon the town square. By quarter till midnight, nearly every resident stood in the dimly lit heart of Millfield. The familiar square had been transformed by the shadows. Lanterns, dim and flickering, lined the main street, casting an otherworldly glow. People exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. There was a strange, electric anticipation in the air. Then, just as the clock struck 12, a low, haunting melody drifted through the town square. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard, something eerie and ethereal, as though 100 voices were humming in unison, calling from deep beneath the earth. It crept into their bones, seeping into the cracks of the night. People turned, looking for the source of the music, but the air itself seemed to vibrate with the haunting tune. Out of the darkness, the first float appeared, moving in a slow, almost hypnotic procession. But this was no ordinary float. It was draped in tattered flags, weather-beaten and torn, bearing strange symbols that were familiar yet wrong. People squinted, trying to make out the emblems, only to feel a sense of dread as they realized they didn't recognize them at all. The flag looked aged, worn, as though it had been buried for years and then resurrected just for this night. Figures adorned the float, human-like yet off. They wore masks that seemed to meld with their faces, painted with exaggerated, grotesque expressions. Each face was frozen in an unnatural grin or a twisted grimace, staring blankly into the crowd. The costumes they wore were once vibrant but had faded into a patchwork of dull reds, whites, and blues, almost like funeral attire. As the float moved past, more followed. Each float was more disturbing than the last. Some displayed mannequins dressed in colonial garb, their painted eyes staring vacantly, while others were filled with mounds of broken dolls, their faces shattered, twisted limbs pointing in every direction. The strange music grew louder, and the townspeople, frozen in place, could only watch as the horror unfolded before them. Then, something caught their eye on one of the floats. A familiar face, a young woman named Clara, who had disappeared years ago without a trace. Her image was grotesquely painted on a mask, and she sat propped up, as though she'd been a part of the float for centuries. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling through them. There was no mistaking it. The float carried images and twisted representations of those who had disappeared, those who were long mourned but never forgotten. People began to back away, fear flooding their veins. But as they tried to retreat, they realized with horror that they couldn't move. Their feet felt as though they'd been anchored to the ground, rooted in place. The strange music grew louder, drowning out their panicked breaths, and the floats continued to roll by. Then, a voice echoed through the square, low and resonant, carrying a tone that sent chills racing down their spines. "Welcome, Millfield," it said. "You answered our invitation. Now, join the midnight parade." The figures on the floats moved, slowly turning their heads toward the crowd, their eyes glinting with something alive. Shadows swirled around them, twisting and contorting as though they were not just costumes but actual creatures that lived within the night. The masks on their faces shifted, grins growing wider, and the mannequins moved in sync with the eerie music, swaying as if possessed. Panic broke through the crowd, but the more they struggled, the heavier their feet felt, as if something beneath the earth were holding them in place. People screamed, their voices muffled by the haunting melody that filled the air. One by one, the townsfolk began to disappear, pulled into the darkness by invisible hands, until only a few were left standing, paralyzed by fear. The last float rolled in, larger and darker than the others, draped in a massive cloak of shadows that seemed to suck in all the light around it. Atop it sat a figure unlike any they had ever seen, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden but its eyes glinting with a hunger that sent waves of terror through those who remained. The figure raised a skeletal hand, beckoning them forward. And as the last of the townsfolk felt themselves drawn toward the parade, they realized with dawning horror that this was their fate. They were to become part of the midnight parade, joining the twisted, eternal procession that marched in silence beneath the indifferent stars. As the sun rose on July 5th, Millfield was silent. The square was empty, the lanterns dimmed, and the strange, metallic-scented invitations were gone. The town stood, untouched but hollow, as though the very soul of Millfield had vanished. For years, the story of Millfield's midnight parade became a legend whispered among neighboring towns. Occasionally, a drifter or lost hiker would claim to hear faint music near the deserted town square, a melody as haunting as it was hypnotic, echoing through the empty streets. No one dared to investigate, for everyone knew the truth. Once you accepted the invitation to the midnight parade, there was no coming back. Story 2. The Midnight Parade. Curiosity and excitement. The sky darkened, painted with streaks of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the small town of Millfield in the warm glow of twilight. But as the daylight faded, a strange tension simmered in the air, mingling with the usual 4th of July celebrations. Children ran through the streets with sparklers, and laughter echoed from backyards where families gathered for cookouts, but there was a murmur beneath it all, a whisper of something unknown that seemed to ripple through every conversation. By now, everyone had heard about the midnight parade invitation. It had been the sole topic of conversation since morning, and the anticipation was palpable. People exchanged knowing glances, raised eyebrows, and whispered speculations as they clinked glasses and ate slices of pie. The town, usually quiet and predictable, was alive with curiosity. The idea of a midnight parade was strange but intriguing. It was the first time anyone could remember Millfield doing something so unusual, and people buzzed with excitement, wondering what kind of spectacle awaited them. Some townsfolk speculated that the midnight parade was a surprise planned by the town council, perhaps an attempt to revive Millfield's dwindling tourist attraction. But others felt uneasy, sensing that there was something unexplainably strange about the invitation. As the night deepened, small groups began to gather on the sidewalks, leaning against white picket fences, sipping drinks, and waiting for the promised parade. The town square, typically a calm and quiet space, became the center of attention. Lanterns had been hung along the main street, and their warm glow flickered, casting long shadows that danced and twisted on the cobblestone road. The anticipation only grew, fueling conversations that speculated on what the midnight celebration would bring. No one knew who had organized the event, and no one claimed responsibility. Some joked that it might be an elaborate prank by the local teenagers, but even those who laughed couldn't shake the chill that crept down their spines each time they thought of the invitation's strange, sticky ink and old-fashioned parchment. By 11 p.m., most of the town had arrived. People crowded the streets, chatting in groups or sitting on the steps of nearby houses, their excitement spilling over into nervous laughter and excited whispers. It was unusual for people to gather so late, especially on a holiday night, but there was something magnetic about the midnight parade. The air itself seemed charged, drawing everyone in as if they were moths pulled toward a flickering flame. The children were especially eager. They danced around their parents, waving sparklers and clapping with glee, thrilled by the late-night gathering. A group of boys in red, white, and blue face paint ran through the crowd, chanting, "Midnight Parade! Midnight Parade!" Their laughter rang out, echoing off the buildings, only to be swallowed by the stillness that followed. But as the minutes slipped closer to midnight, the mood in the crowd began to shift. The familiar sounds of laughter and idle chatter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. People glanced at each other, their expressions tense and expectant. Parents held their children close, their eyes darting from one shadow to another, as if expecting something to leap from the darkness. The town clock struck midnight, its chimes ringing through the square in a hollow, ominous tone. As the final chime echoed into silence, the entire town held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A faint mist began to roll in from the edges of the square, weaving through the crowd like spectral fingers. It was thin and translucent at first, barely more than a haze, but it thickened with each passing moment until it cloaked the streets in an eerie fog. The lanterns cast dim, distorted beams through the mist, their light struggling to penetrate the thickening gloom. Then, from somewhere deep within the mist, a sound drifted toward the crowd. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, swelling into a strange, haunting melody that sent chills skittering down every spine. The music was both beautiful and unsettling, like the ghostly tune of an ancient lullaby, full of mournful notes that tugged at something deep within. The crowd fell silent, entranced by the eerie melody. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, an otherworldly sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The music seemed to seep into their bones, filling them with a strange, unnatural warmth that felt more like a fever than comfort. Some of the younger children began to cry, clinging to their parents with wide, frightened eyes. A figure emerged from the fog, and the townspeople gasped as they caught sight of the first float. It was massive, an elaborate structure made of dark wood, adorned with twisted vines and faded flowers. The float rolled forward, its wheels creaking with every movement, and the lanterns flickered, casting eerie shadows over its grotesque decorations. But what truly unsettled the townsfolk were the figures aboard the float. At first, they appeared to be mannequins, lifeless dolls dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing. But as the float drew closer, people realized with horror that these figures looked disturbingly familiar. There, slouched against the side of the float, was the unmistakable face of Mr. Jenkins, the kindly baker who had passed away just a few months ago. His face, painted in waxy, stared vacantly into the crowd, his once smiling mouth frozen in a twisted grimace. Whispers spread through the crowd, and people clutched each other in fear. Is that Mr. Jenkins?" someone murmured, their voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, another float appeared, rolling slowly through the fog. This one was even more elaborate, decorated with broken mirrors that caught the lantern light, reflecting fractured images of the townsfolk's own frightened faces. Figures adorned this float as well, people who had gone missing over the years, their faces contorted into expressions of agony and despair. The townsfolk felt the pull of terror, but they were rooted to the ground, unable to move or even look away. The haunting music grew louder, and the crowd seemed to sway in time with its eerie rhythm, as if drawn into a trance. The air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. One by one, more floats emerged from the mist, each more grotesque and haunting than the last. Some were adorned with twisted branches and dead flowers, others with faded flags and strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the lantern light. And atop each float were figures, frozen, lifeless forms of people the townsfolk had known, now twisted into ghastly mockeries of their former selves. As the floats passed, some of the townsfolk began to notice something horrifying. The faces on the float seemed to shift. At first, it was subtle, a slight change in the angle of a head or the flicker of an eyelid. But soon, the expressions began to morph, the mouth stretching into unnatural grins, the eyes widening with a chilling awareness. The crowd recoiled, some people stumbling backward, trying to break free from the thrall of the music. But no matter how hard they tried, they could not look away. The haunting melody held them in place, binding them to the square as the procession of nightmare floats continued. Then, as the final float approached, the music reached a crescendo. This float was massive, draped in dark, tattered fabric that seemed to pulse like a living thing. Atop it sat a figure cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light that pierced through the darkness. The figure raised a hand, bony and clawed, and pointed toward the crowd. In that moment, a chilling whisper filled the air, carried by the fog and echoing through the crowd like a sinister chant. "Join us," it whispered, the words slithering into their minds like tendrils of smoke. "Join us in the midnight parade." The townsfolk felt a pull, a magnetic force that seemed to drag them toward the procession. They tried to resist, but their bodies moved of their own accord, stumbling forward, drawn by the music and the voice that echoed in their minds. One by one, they climbed onto the floats, their eyes wide with terror as they felt their limbs grow heavy and numb. They tried to scream, but their voices were swallowed by the haunting melody. Their skin grew cold, their movements stiff, until they, too, were frozen in place, lifeless mannequins in the grotesque parade. As the final chime of midnight faded, the mist began to dissipate, carrying with it the music and the last remnants of the midnight parade. When the fog finally cleared, the square was empty, save for the flickering lanterns and the eerie silence that hung over the town. The next morning, Millfield was a ghost town. The streets were deserted, the houses empty, and the 4th of July decorations lay scattered on the ground, forgotten and abandoned. No one knew what had happened to the townsfolk, but some say that if you stand in the town square at midnight on July 4th, you can still hear the faint strains of a haunting melody echoing through the air. They say that the midnight parade never truly ends, and that somewhere, lost in the mist, the people of Millfield march on, forever trapped in a spectral procession, their frozen faces twisted into silent screams, forever part of the midnight parade. Story 3. The Midnight Parade. The Gathering. As the clock struck midnight, a hush fell over Millfield. The townspeople, drawn by an unseen force, congregated at the park, the heart of their small community. Lanterns flickered to life, casting warm pools of light against the cool night air, illuminating their anxious faces. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, yet a palpable unease lingered beneath the surface, creeping in like the shadows that danced along the ground. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The air, typically filled with the sounds of cicadas and rustling leaves, now held an eerie stillness, as if the very world held its breath, waiting for something ominous to unfold. They had come to celebrate, to partake in what was promised to be an extraordinary spectacle. But as they stood in the park, anxiety seeped into their bones. From somewhere deep within the darkness, eerie music drifted through the air, weaving between the branches of the trees. It was not the jovial tunes of a parade but rather a haunting melody that seemed to echo from beyond the veil of reality, a sound that sent shivers down their spines and made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "What is that?" a woman whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. Others murmured in response, unsure if they should be curious or terrified. The lanterns cast flickering shadows that danced along the ground, twisting and contorting as if they had a life of their own. The darkness around the park thickened, deepening the shadows and creating an almost tangible sense of dread. Despite the chill in the air, sweat trickled down the backs of some necks as the music crescendoed, blending with the faint tremors of the earth beneath their feet. Then they saw it, faint flickers of light approaching from the distance, weaving between the trees. It was as if the very night was alive, with glowing orbs floating just beyond the edges of the park, beckoning them forward. The townspeople exchanged worried glances, their hearts pounding in unison. They were rooted to the spot, both compelled and terrified to move. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the park, followed by a rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from the very ground. It reverberated through their bones, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd. People shifted nervously, looking toward the source of the sound. Shadows danced at the periphery of their vision, and the air grew heavier, thick with an unnatural tension. "Maybe we should leave," someone suggested, their voice shaking. But before anyone could respond, the flickering lights intensified, swirling in a mesmerizing pattern that captivated the onlookers. The lights grew brighter, revealing forms that materialized from the mist. Tall figures emerged, draped in flowing garments that billowed around them, adorned with garlands of twisted branches and leaves. The figures moved with a grace that was unsettling, gliding over the ground as though they were untethered by gravity. Their faces were obscured by masks, intricately designed and painted, each one a grotesque parody of joy and sorrow intertwined. A palpable wave of fear washed over the crowd, but it was intertwined with an inexplicable fascination. The music swelled, echoing through the trees, wrapping around them like a dark cocoon. The townspeople felt a tug in their hearts, a pull that urged them to step closer, to see the figures more clearly, to understand the enchantment that held them captive. One by one, they moved forward, hesitant but unable to resist the lure of the gathering. The air buzzed with energy, and the ground beneath them pulsed like a living entity, matching the rhythm of the haunting melody. As they drew closer, the figures began to dance, their movements fluid and hypnotic, weaving through the throng of townsfolk with a grace that felt almost otherworldly. Suddenly, a shrill cry pierced the night, jolting the crowd from its stupor. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, screamed as she stumbled backward, her face pale with terror. "Mommy! I want to go home," she cried, her small frame shaking. A sense of panic surged through the crowd as parents rushed to comfort their children, their instincts kicking in. The spell that had held them was broken, and they turned to flee, but the path out of the park had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and flickering lights. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches stretching and twisting as if alive, blocking any chance of escape. The figures continued their dance, moving closer to the townsfolk, their masks now casting menacing shadows over their features. They twirled and leaped, their movements a dizzying display of elegance that felt both captivating and terrifying. The music reached a fever pitch, echoing the chaos of the crowd as people shouted for help, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear. "Run! Get out!" a man yelled, his voice cutting through the din. He turned to push through the throng, but the shadows thickened, swirling around him like a dark fog. Panic gripped him as he felt hands, cold and clammy, reach out from the darkness, gripping his wrists and pulling him back into the dance. The townspeople tried to regroup, but their attempts were futile. One by one, they were caught in the spectral embrace of the dancers, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the haunting melody. It was as if the very essence of the parade was consuming them, twisting their wills until they, too, were lost in the dance. "Help me," someone cried, their voice a desperate plea swallowed by the night. A woman stumbled, reaching for a friend, but the ground beneath her shifted, opening like a chasm. She fell into darkness, her scream abruptly cut off as the shadows engulfed her. The music twisted, morphing from enchanting to chaotic, reflecting the turmoil of the crowd. People were drawn deeper into the park, their movements no longer their own, as the figures continued to dance around them. The laughter of the figures echoed through the trees, a chilling sound that mocked their fear. Among the chaos, a man named David fought against the tide. He had lived in Millfield his entire life, a familiar face in every household, and he couldn't let this night end in despair. Clenching his fists, he forced his way through the crowd, determined to reach the little girl who had cried out. He spotted her, trembling against a tree, her small hands covering her ears. "Come on. We have to go," David shouted, stretching out his hand. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear, but she took a hesitant step forward, still clutching the trunk of the tree. But before David could reach her, the figures closed in, their dance enveloping the space. They swirled around him, their masks tilting in his direction, eyes gleaming with an unsettling hunger. The music crescendoed, drowning out the cries and shouts, filling the air with a dissonance that rattled his very core. The girl let out a terrified scream, and David felt a surge of desperation. "No! Stay with me," he shouted, breaking free from the throng. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he dashed toward her, reaching for her hand just as the shadows began to encircle her. In that moment, something snapped within him. As he grasped her tiny hand, the shadows recoiled, and the haunting music shifted, an eerie dissonance reverberating through the air. It felt as though the very fabric of the night quivered, a ripple of fear passing through the dancers. "Run!" David urged, pulling the girl toward the edge of the park. The shadows writhed and twisted, reaching out as though trying to reclaim their prey. He could feel the cold air closing in, but he refused to let go. They barreled toward the clearing, hearts pounding as the music swelled and warped around them. Just as they neared the entrance, the ground trembled violently, and a thunderous roar filled the air, drowning out everything else. The park erupted in chaos as the figures paused, momentarily stunned, their dark forms shimmering in the flickering light. It was enough of a distraction. David pushed through the final barrier of trees, bursting into the cool night air outside the park, the girl's hand clutched tightly in his. He turned, glancing back at the swirling shadows, the music reaching a haunting peak behind him. The figures stood still for a moment, their dance interrupted, as if processing the loss of their prey. And then, as if awakened from a dream, the figures resumed their movements, but they were no longer just dancers. They turned, their faces contorting into grotesque expressions of rage and despair, and the music morphed into a guttural scream that pierced the night. David pulled the girl along, sprinting down the street, heart racing as they fled from the park. He could feel the ground tremble beneath him, and a low rumble echoed in the distance, but he didn't stop. The cries and pleas of the townsfolk faded behind them, replaced by the unrelenting music that threatened to follow. "Are they coming?" the girl whimpered, glancing back at the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the park. "No, we have to keep running," David replied, his voice firm, though he could feel the terror creeping into his own heart. The streets of Millfield were empty, the houses silent, as if the entire town had vanished. David glanced over his shoulder again, half expecting to see the figures following them, but the park lay still and quiet, the lanterns dimming in the distance. They continued their flight, until they reached the safety of David's home, a modest house that stood as a beacon of familiarity. He flung open the door, ushering the girl inside, and slammed it shut behind them. "Stay here," he ordered, moving to the window, peering out into the night. The music had faded to a distant echo, but he could still feel its grip on his heart. "Are they gone?" the girl asked, her voice trembling as she hugged her knees to her chest. "I think so," David replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. He turned to face her, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "It's okay. You're safe now." But as he stood in the dim light of his living room, he felt the shadows creeping closer, pooling in the corners of the room. The air grew thick, and a chill swept through the house. The lanterns outside flickered violently, casting long, stretching shadows that twisted and morphed along the walls. "No," he yelled, backing away. "Not here." In that moment, the front door rattled violently, shaking in its frame. David's heart raced as he rushed to block it, but the shadows slipped through the cracks, swirling around him, creeping toward the girl who cowered in the corner. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. But the shadows had taken form, coalescing into the figures from the park, their masks now devoid of any mirth, replaced with ghastly expressions of hunger and anger. They moved forward, a collective entity, the music echoing from their very beings, wrapping around the house like a noose. David stood between the figures and the girl, a fierce determination igniting within him. "You can't have her," he shouted, his voice shaking with fear, but resolute. "Leave us alone." The figures paused, their eyes glimmering with an unnatural light, and the music shifted, rising and falling like the swell of a tide. It was a melody full of sorrow, a mournful tune that clawed at his heart, threatening to pull him in. But in that moment, David remembered the girl's terrified face, the way she had looked when she had cried for help. With every ounce of strength he had left, he shouted, "You won't take her. We are not yours." The figures lurched forward, their forms shifting and twisting, but David felt a surge of power coursing through him, a warmth that pulsed with his heartbeat. The shadows recoiled, flickering like candle flames in the wind. "Run," he urged the girl. "Get out." She hesitated, looking up at him, her eyes wide and fearful. "But—" "Go," he commanded, and with a final, desperate push, he shoved her toward the back door. The girl bolted past him, darting through the kitchen and out into the night. David turned to face the figures, feeling their icy tendrils reach out for him, the music growing louder, more insistent. But he wouldn't allow them to claim her. With a shout of defiance, he leaped forward, breaking the hold of the shadows, forcing himself through the figures as they attempted to surround him. The music reached a deafening crescendo, the shadows shrieking in rage and despair as they struggled to keep him within their grasp. David stumbled outside, the night air hitting him like a wave, the cold feeling invigorating as he ran to catch up with the girl. The shadows writhed behind him, but he could feel their power waning, the music shifting to a mournful wail that echoed through the air. "Where are you?" he called out, desperation clawing at his throat. He spotted her a few yards ahead, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she cried, and he rushed to her side, pulling her close. "We'll be okay," he promised, though fear tightened his chest. "Just keep moving." Together, they ran through the empty streets of Millfield, leaving the shadows and music behind them. As they reached the outskirts of town, the oppressive darkness began to lift, the glow of the lanterns fading into the distance. The oppressive weight of the night seemed to lighten, and David could feel a shift in the air, as though the town itself was releasing a breath it had held too long. They stumbled into a clearing just outside Millfield, breathless and shaken. The stars twinkled above, and the haunting music faded to a whisper, a distant echo that sent shivers down their spines. "We did it," David gasped, looking down at the girl, who was still trembling in his arms. "We're safe." But just as relief washed over him, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and he looked back toward the town. The shadows stirred, gathering once more, swirling together in a dark tempest that rose high into the air. "No," he shouted, holding the girl close. "Not again." The shadows surged toward them, racing across the ground like a tidal wave. The music swelled again, a haunting crescendo that echoed through the night, but this time it was a cry of rage, a battle cry that pierced the darkness. In that moment, David felt the pull of fear grip him anew, but he refused to back down. "You will not take us," he roared, his voice echoing across the clearing. The shadows paused, as if surprised by his defiance. The music faltered, shifting from a chaotic wail to a dissonant harmony. For a fleeting moment, the darkness hesitated, swirling uncertainly around them. With a surge of determination, David took a step forward, the girl still clutched tightly to his side. "You think you can take us? You are nothing but shadows." The darkness writhed, and the figures from the midnight parade flickered at the edges of the clearing, their grotesque forms shifting in and out of existence. The music trembled in response, caught in a conflict between the haunting melody and the force of David's defiance. And in that moment, something shifted within him. The shadows began to shrink back, their forms faltering, as if his conviction held power over them. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide, and he could see hope sparking within her. Keep going. David urged her, and she stepped forward, determination etched on her small face. Together, they took another step, and the shadows hissed, recoiling from their combined force. The music shifted again, a dissonant clash echoing in the night as the figures turned to retreat, drawn back by the strength of their resolve. "Let's go!" David shouted, pulling the girl with him as they turned to flee deeper into the woods, away from Millfield, away from the nightmare. As they ran, the shadows faded behind them, their cries turning to whispers that echoed in the night, and the music transformed into a distant wail, slowly dissipating into the wind. The trees around them stood tall and silent, shielding them from the darkness as they pressed on. They could still feel the lingering weight of the midnight parade behind them, but with each step, the oppressive darkness lessened, and they found solace in the light of the stars above. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into a small clearing, the air fresh and filled with the sounds of nature. David stopped, breathless, glancing back toward the shadows that had pursued them. The darkness was far behind, and the haunting music was nothing but a memory now. "We did it," he whispered, his voice shaky with disbelief. The girl looked up at him, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Are we safe now?" David nodded, pulling her close. "Yes, we're safe. They can't hurt us anymore." But deep down, he knew the truth. The midnight parade was not truly gone, it had simply retreated, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next July 4th, the next gathering of Millfield's unsuspecting townsfolk. And as long as the parade existed, its hunger would remain unquenched. But for now, in this moment, they were free. They stood together in the moonlight, surrounded by the quiet of the woods, grateful for their escape from the darkness, even as the memory of the midnight parade loomed just out of reach, a chilling reminder of the horrors they had narrowly avoided. And as they turned to leave the clearing, the soft strains of haunting music whispered through the trees, a gentle reminder that the midnight parade would return, and when it did, they would be ready. Story 4. The Midnight Parade. The First Float. As the figures of the midnight parade swirled around the park, a thick anticipation hung in the air, pulsing with the rhythm of the haunting music. The crowd was in a trance, their eyes wide, mesmerized by the bizarre scene unfolding before them. The whispers of fear were drowned out by the ethereal melody, drawing them deeper into the shadows. Then, as if summoned by the collective breath of the townspeople, the first float emerged from the darkness. It creaked ominously as it glided into view, the lanterns illuminating its sinister design. Draped in tattered flags that fluttered like the wings of some forgotten creature, the float seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The faded colors were a macabre homage to the 4th of July, twisted into something grotesque. On the float, figures twisted and contorted in a dance that was both beautiful and horrifying. Their faces were obscured by ornate masks, expressions of joy and despair fused into one. As the crowd gazed at the spectacle, a chill crept down their spines. The figures moved with an unsettling grace, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, as if they were marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The music morphed, twisting into a chilling melody that echoed through the park. It was a dirge disguised as a celebration, each note sending shivers through the spectators. A sense of dread slithered into the hearts of the townsfolk, but they remained transfixed, unable to look away from the grotesque dance playing out before them. "Look at them," someone whispered, their voice trembling. "What are they?" "I don't know," another replied, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "But, it's beautiful." The figures on the float moved in synchrony, a hypnotic rhythm that entranced the crowd. Some began to sway to the music, caught in the spell woven by the eerie melody. A few brave souls stepped forward, compelled by a force they could not understand, their bodies moving as if puppeteered by unseen hands. As the first float advanced, it revealed more grotesque figures, each one more horrifying than the last. Some appeared to be half human, half creature, with limbs that stretched and twisted in unnatural ways. Others were clad in tattered garments that billowed around them like the remnants of lost souls, their faces twisted in expressions that sent chills coursing through the onlookers. David, still shaken from the events earlier in the night, stood at the edge of the gathering, clutching the little girl's hand. He felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him as he watched the crowd succumb to the parade's eerie allure. "We have to get out of here," he whispered urgently, but the girl's wide eyes were glued to the float. "Look at them, David. They're dancing," she exclaimed, a mix of fear and wonder in her voice. "No. This isn't right," he insisted, trying to pull her away from the thrumming pulse of the crowd. But his voice was drowned out by the music, which crescendoed, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The float began to spin, and the figures danced with abandon, their movements growing more frenetic. The haunting melody wove itself into the very fabric of the night, and as the crowd swayed in time, David's heart raced. He could feel the shadows tugging at the edges of his mind, whispering promises of joy wrapped in a veil of despair. As the float approached, David caught a glimpse of its true nature. Beneath the tattered flags and the enchanting facade, it was a grotesque spectacle, a carnival of lost souls, trapped in an eternal dance. The figures on the float twisted and turned, their eyes glinting with an otherworldly hunger. They seemed to beckon the townsfolk closer, their fingers elongated and skeletal, as if reaching for something just beyond the veil of reality. "David, I want to see more," the girl pleaded, tugging at his hand. "No. We have to go," he said, pulling her back as he scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. But everyone was enraptured, caught in the thrall of the macabre celebration, their eyes glazed over as they surrendered to the night. With a surge of desperation, David moved to shield the girl from the float, blocking her view of the dancers. But the music intensified, each note like a knife digging into his resolve. "Stay close to me," he warned, feeling the oppressive weight of the shadows creeping in around them. The float continued its procession, revealing more grotesque figures that seemed to emerge from the depths of the shadows, each more terrifying than the last. One figure, adorned with a mask that resembled a grinning skull, raised its arms, beckoning the crowd forward as though offering them a choice, to join the dance or to remain on the fringes, forever haunted by the echoes of the midnight parade. The townspeople, entranced, began to shuffle closer, drawn in by the seductive allure of the float. David's heart raced as he noticed a few of them stepping onto the float itself, lost in the rhythm, their faces transformed by the masks that concealed their humanity. It was a scene from a nightmare, unfolding before his eyes, a slow descent into madness. "David," the girl's voice trembled beside him, snapping him back to reality. "I'm scared." He turned to her, his heart aching. "I know. We need to get out of here. Now." He scanned the park, searching for a way out, but the path seemed to close in around them, the shadows thickening as the music pulled everyone deeper into the spectacle. "Let's go," he urged, gripping her hand tightly, and they began to push through the crowd. The townsfolk barely registered their presence, their eyes locked onto the float, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights. As they navigated through the throng, David felt the pull of the music tightening around them, trying to reel them back in. Each step was a battle against the invisible forces that sought to ensnare them. He could see the first float ahead, moving ever closer, the figures on it spinning wildly, their laughter echoing with a sinister edge. The girl stumbled beside him, and he quickly steadied her. "Keep your eyes on me," he shouted, forcing his way through the throng. The world felt like it was closing in around them, the shadows whispering temptations that clawed at the edges of his mind. Finally, they broke through the crowd, emerging into a small clearing where the shadows seemed to thin. But the music still echoed in the air, a haunting reminder of the nightmare they had narrowly escaped. David looked back at the crowd, horrified to see several people had joined the figures on the float, their bodies swaying in a hypnotic dance, faces obscured by masks that glinted in the light. "Where do we go now?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. David glanced around, searching for a path that led away from the darkness. "We need to find somewhere safe, away from this place," he said, the weight of fear heavy in his chest. But as they turned to leave, the music shifted again, morphing into a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the ground. The float began to sway, the figures spinning faster, their movements growing more erratic, as if they were responding to an unseen force. The lights dimmed, flickering ominously as the shadows closed in around the park, encroaching on the clearing where they stood. A figure stepped off the float, a tall being cloaked in shadows, its mask a grotesque representation of a jester's grin, and it approached them with a fluid grace that sent chills down David's spine. "You can't leave," it crooned, its voice echoing in the night, dripping with malice. "You're part of the show now. Get away from us." David shouted, pulling the girl closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The jester figure laughed, a sound that sliced through the air, sending a wave of panic surging through him. "The parade welcomes you," it taunted, its voice melodic yet terrifying. "You can join us or remain as you are, lost and alone. The choice is yours." With a fierce determination, David stepped forward, his resolve hardening. "We're not afraid of you," he declared, even as the shadows flickered around him, whispering doubts that clawed at his mind. But the jester only laughed, the sound echoing off the trees, filling the air with a dissonant melody. "Ah, but you will be. The Midnight Parade has a way of revealing your deepest fears." As it spoke, the shadows began to swirl around David and the girl, enveloping them in a thick darkness. David's heart raced as he felt the pressure closing in, the shadows whispering secrets of despair that wormed their way into his thoughts. He could feel the girl trembling beside him, her small hand clutching his tightly, and he couldn't let her go. "No," he shouted, shaking his head as if to dispel the darkness. "We won't be part of this." He turned to the girl, his eyes fierce with determination. "Stay with me. We're getting out of here." With a sudden burst of adrenaline, David pushed through the encroaching shadows, pulling the girl along with him. The jester figure laughed again, its voice mocking as they raced toward the edge of the clearing. But the shadows danced at their heels, grasping at their clothes, pulling them back into the nightmare. The music surged, transforming into a cacophony of sound that threatened to drown out everything else. David's heart pounded as he glanced back at the float, where the figures continued to sway and dance, their eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. "Run!" he shouted, and they broke into a sprint, barreling toward the trees lining the edge of the park. The shadows clawed at their backs, a dark tide rising to consume them, but he pushed forward, determination fueling his every step. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, David felt a cold grip on his ankle, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. The shadows surged around him, wrapping around his legs like serpents, threatening to drag him into the abyss. "David," the girl screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Help! Go!" he yelled, desperation clawing at his throat. "Run! Don't look back!" But she wouldn't leave him. David could see the determination in her eyes, the same fierce spirit that had pushed them through the darkness. "I won't leave you," she cried, reaching for him, her small hand slipping into his. "Please," he begged, feeling the shadows tightening their grip, pulling him down into the depths. "You have to go. You can still escape." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she shook her head, resolute. "I won't leave you behind." In that moment, something within David ignited, a fierce determination born of love and courage. "Then we fight," he shouted, his voice breaking through the darkness. "Together." As the shadows closed in, David felt the warmth of the girl's hand in his, and he drew strength from her presence. He reached deep within himself, summoning every ounce of defiance against the encroaching darkness. With a roar of fury, he pulled himself up, the shadows recoiling as if burned by the light of their resolve. "Get back," he shouted, pushing against the weight of the darkness. The jester figure lurked at the edge of the clearing, its laughter ringing in the night as it watched their struggle with malevolent glee. But David wouldn't back down. "You don't own us," he yelled, feeling the warmth of determination wash over him. The shadows flickered, hesitating as if unsure of how to respond to their defiance. Together, they fought back against the encroaching darkness. David gripped the girl's hand tightly, pulling her closer as they stood against the tide of shadows. The music shifted again, transforming from a haunting melody into a frenzied cacophony, reflecting the chaos swirling around them. "We can do this," David urged, his heart pounding with renewed hope. "We won't let them take us." And as they stood there, defiance burning in their hearts, the shadows began to retreat. The jester figure howled in rage, the laughter fading as the darkness pulled back, retreating into the shadows from which it had emerged. "Run!" David shouted, and they dashed toward the trees, breaking free from the clutches of the midnight parade. The shadows swirled behind them, but the light of their resolve pushed them forward, guiding them away from the nightmare. They burst into the safety of the woods, the cool night air rushing around them as they stumbled deeper into the embrace of the trees. The music faded into a distant echo, the haunting melody replaced by the sounds of nature. David turned to the girl, who was breathless and wide-eyed, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "We did it," he whispered, disbelief flooding through him. "We're safe." But as they stood there, surrounded by the silence of the woods, the weight of what had happened began to settle in. The memory of the first float lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. "They'll come back," the girl said softly, her voice trembling. "The parade, it's not over, is it?" David shook his head, knowing she was right. "No, it's not. But we won't let them take us. We'll be ready next time." With that resolve, they turned and continued deeper into the woods, leaving the remnants of the midnight parade behind them, determined to face whatever darkness awaited them in the night. Story 5. The Midnight Parade. The Spectators. As the haunting melody echoed through Millfield, the initial thrill of the midnight parade began to wane, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The townsfolk stood together, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns, but as they gazed at the floats, their excitement turned to horror. The figures dancing and twirling on the elaborate floats bore uncanny resemblances to those who had vanished from their lives, friends, family members, loved ones who had disappeared into the shadows of time. With each float that passed, gasps rippled through the crowd. The first float, adorned with tattered flags, displayed figures that resembled Mary Thompson, the cheerful baker who had gone missing 5 years ago. She danced gracefully, her face hidden behind a mask that twisted her features into a grotesque parody of joy. The townsfolk could almost hear her laughter mingling with the music, but it felt wrong, tainted by something sinister. "Is that Mary?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. "It can't be," another replied, backing away from the edge of the throng. As the next float emerged, it showcased a figure draped in a flowing gown, its face partially obscured by a veil. The crowd fell silent, eyes wide with disbelief as they recognized the lost form of Betty Monroe, a beloved schoolteacher who had vanished during a storm 3 years ago. Her ethereal figure floated above the float, her arms outstretched, beckoning the townsfolk closer with a mournful grace. "What's happening?" a voice broke through the stunned silence. "This isn't right." David, still reeling from the night's events, felt a shiver run down his spine as he turned to the girl beside him. Her expression mirrored his own, confusion and fear intertwining as the parade revealed more chilling truths. He watched as the crowd swayed, caught between fascination and horror. "It's a trick," he muttered, forcing himself to sound confident. "They're not real. They can't be." But doubt crept into his mind as another float glided into view. This one bore a figure that struck deep into his heart, a shadowy silhouette of his brother, who had disappeared during a camping trip 5 years earlier. The figure's eyes glowed with a haunting light, and for a moment, David felt an overwhelming urge to step forward, to reach out and grasp the hand of the figure who resembled his brother so closely. "David, don't," the girl cried, grabbing his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not him." He shook his head, the pain of loss crashing over him like a tidal wave. "It looks just like him. It can't be a coincidence." As the parade continued, the figures on the floats became increasingly disturbing. Each float unveiled more familiar faces, friends, neighbors, those who had vanished without a trace, their stories buried beneath years of unanswered questions. David felt the weight of sorrow enveloping him, as the memories of those lost washed over him in waves. He glanced around at the townsfolk, their faces pale, fear etched into every line. Some had fallen to their knees, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed their pasts materializing before them. Others were frozen in shock, unable to look away from the spectral dancers that paraded before them, the music wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. "David, we need to go," the girl urged, tugging at his arm. This isn't safe. No, we can't leave now. We have to find out what this is, he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. The truth of the situation hung heavily in the air, and he felt compelled to understand it, even as the shadows continued to encroach upon their fragile reality. With each float that passed, the townsfolk began to murmur amongst themselves, questions hanging in the air like storm clouds. How can this be happening? One man asked, his voice barely audible over the music. Are they trying to mock us? They're toying with our grief, another replied, their voice laced with anger. These are our loved ones. How dare they? David's heart raced as he glanced at the girl beside him. We have to find a way to stop this, he said urgently, his mind racing with possibilities. We can't let them keep doing this to us. But the crowd was restless, their fear morphing into something darker. As the next float rolled in, a figure resembling the town's former mayor emerged, draped in chains and wearing a mask that appeared to be crafted from the very darkness that surrounded them. The sight ignited a spark of rage in the crowd, and angry voices began to rise above the music. Why are they doing this? Someone shouted, their voice trembling with outrage. Why are they parading our dead before us? We need to get out of here, another voice cried, panic rippling through the throng. The music shifted, growing louder and more frenetic as the figures danced on the floats, their movements becoming increasingly erratic. Shadows swirled around them, as if the very air was charged with the weight of their grief. David felt the pull of fear gripping him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the girl's trembling hand in his. Stay close to me, he said firmly. We need to keep moving. There has to be a way to stop this. As they moved through the crowd, David caught glimpses of the townsfolk's expressions, a mix of anguish and anger painted on their faces. Some began to shout at the figures on the floats, desperate for answers that would never come. Bring them back, someone yelled, their voice cracking. You can't just take them from us. David felt a surge of determination as he navigated through the chaos. The shadows pressed in on them, the music crescendoing to a fever pitch, each note a reminder of the pain they had all endured. He caught sight of the girl beside him, her eyes wide with fear, and it drove him to push forward. Look, he shouted, pointing to the edge of the park. There's a path leading away from the crowd. The girl nodded, and they fought their way through the throngs of people, desperate to escape the thrall of the parade. As they neared the path, David glanced back, feeling a strange compulsion to look at the floats once more. The figures were now more animated, the music pulsing as the townsfolk struggled against the pull of the spectacle. A wave of anger surged through David as he saw a group of people begin to dance along with the figures, caught in the rhythm of the haunting melody. No, he shouted, horrified. Don't give in. They're not real. But his voice was lost in the cacophony. The shadows thickened, swallowing the light as the figures on the floats began to spin faster, their movements becoming a blur of color and darkness. David felt a surge of panic as he and the girl reached the edge of the park, the path leading into the thick woods that surrounded Millfield. Quick, he urged, pulling her along. They stepped off the beaten path and into the trees, the shadows falling away behind them, replaced by the cool, still air of the forest. But the haunting melody echoed in the distance, a reminder of the horror they had left behind. As they moved deeper into the woods, David turned to the girl, who was breathing heavily, her small frame trembling. Are you okay? He asked, concern etched across his face. I think so, she replied, her voice shaky. But what about the others? We can't just leave them. We have to regroup, David said, his mind racing. We need to figure out how to stop this parade. There has to be a way to break its hold on the town. The girl nodded, determination shining through her fear. But how? They were all so real. David clenched his jaw, the pain of loss still fresh in his heart. They may look real, but they're just manifestations of our grief, our memories. We can't let them control us. The two of them continued to navigate through the forest, their surroundings becoming darker with each step. The distant music faded, but the weight of the night still clung to them, a reminder of the horrors they had witnessed. David led the girl deeper into the woods, seeking a hidden place where they could think without the oppressive shadows closing in. After what felt like an eternity of walking, they stumbled upon a small clearing, moonlight filtering through the trees above, casting an ethereal glow on the ground. David took a deep breath, the fresh air calming his racing heart. "This is where we'll figure things out," he declared, scanning their surroundings. "If we can understand what's happening, maybe we can stop the parade from coming back." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. "But how?" "They looked so real, David. I felt like I could reach out and touch them." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But they're not really here. They're just echoes of our pain. We have to confront that pain, our grief, and show the parade that it has no power over us." As they sat in the clearing, the moonlight illuminating their faces, David felt a flicker of hope amid the darkness. "We'll find a way," he said, gripping the girl's hand tightly. "Together." But as they sat there, the shadows began to swirl around the clearing, creeping closer, the oppressive weight of the night pressing in on them. David's heart raced as he felt the darkness closing in, but he steeled himself, determined to confront whatever awaited them. "Let them come," he said fiercely, his voice cutting through the silence. "We won't back down." And with that resolve, they prepared to face the darkness, ready to confront the memories that haunted them and the specters of the past that threatened to consume their future. Story 6. The Reveal. As the final float rolled into view, the air crackled with a tension so thick it felt almost palpable. The townsfolk stood frozen, their eyes glued to the looming figure draped in a cloak made of swirling stars and shadows. It towered over the parade, an entity of darkness and light, both mesmerizing and horrifying. The soft glow of the lanterns flickered against the creature, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. The music faded to a haunting silence as the figure raised its arms, the cloak billowing like a stormy sky, an unfathomable void within it. A chilling wind swept through the park, causing the townspeople to shiver involuntarily, their hearts pounding in their chests. "You summoned us," the figure's voice echoed, deep and resonant, filling the air with a commanding presence. "And now you must join the parade." Gasps erupted from the crowd, fear igniting like wildfire as the meaning of its words sunk in. David felt the girl's hand tighten around his, her fear palpable as she stared wide-eyed at the figure. "What does it mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," David replied, dread coiling in his stomach. "But we have to get out of here. We can't let it take us." The townspeople were frozen in place, a mix of fear and disbelief washing over them. They exchanged glances, many struggling to process the reality unfolding before them. One brave soul stepped forward, shaking slightly but determined. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, the stars in its cloak shimmering ominously. "You've summoned me with your grief, your sorrow. You have called forth the memories of those you have lost. Now, they shall dance in the parade for eternity, and you shall join them." The crowd gasped, panic spreading like a disease. Some turned to flee, but the shadows that had been lingering in the park coiled around their feet, preventing escape. David's heart raced as he looked around, seeing the fear in the eyes of his neighbors, the dread etched on their faces. "We can't let this happen," David shouted, trying to rally the townsfolk. "We have to fight back. We have to remember that they wouldn't want this for us." But the figure's laughter echoed through the night, a sound so chilling it sent shivers down David's spine. "You think you can resist? You think your love can protect you? No, it only binds you to your pain. Join us, and find peace among the stars." The townspeople began to murmur among themselves, uncertainty creeping into their hearts. Some looked as if they were teetering on the edge of surrender, the weight of loss heavy on their shoulders. David felt the girl's grip loosen, and panic surged within him. "No," he shouted, desperately searching the faces of his neighbors. "Don't listen to it. We have to stand together." But the figure raised its hands again, and the shadows surged forth, intertwining with the crowd. The townsfolk staggered back, overwhelmed by the presence of the dark entity. It felt as if the very air around them thickened, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. David looked at the girl, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't let them take us," he urged, desperation lacing his voice. "We have to remember who we are and who they were." She nodded, and together they took a step forward, bracing against the overwhelming shadows. "Our grief doesn't define us," David cried, his voice rising above the chaos. "We loved them, and they loved us. They wouldn't want this for us." The townsfolk began to stir, his words cutting through the despair that threatened to consume them. Some looked at one another, sharing glimmers of hope as David's declaration hung in the air. "Remember the joy they brought us," the girl shouted, her voice rising with determination. "They wouldn't want us to give in to the darkness." The figure's eyes narrowed, and the shadows recoiled slightly, as if stung by their defiance. "You think your memories will save you? You are bound to the pain of your loss. Embrace it, or be consumed." David felt a surge of strength as the townsfolk began to stand a little taller, anger replacing fear. "We will not be defined by our losses," he shouted, rallying them. "We remember our loved ones not through sorrow, but through the joy they brought into our lives." With each word, David felt a light flicker within the crowd, and the shadows began to waver, their grip weakening. The townsfolk joined him, voices rising in unison, chanting the names of those they had lost, invoking memories of laughter, love, and warmth. "Mary! Betty! Jacob," they called out, the names echoing through the night, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. As the names filled the air, the figure recoiled, its form flickering as if caught in a storm. "No! You cannot fight me! You are mine," it screeched, its voice echoing with a mix of fury and desperation. David felt the energy shift, the shadows around them retreating, battling against the overwhelming love that surged through the crowd. They remembered not just their losses, but the joy and laughter that had once filled their lives, memories brightening the darkness. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the heart of the crowd, illuminating the park and pushing back against the shadows. The figure's form began to dissolve, the cloak of stars unraveling into wisps of darkness, scattering like smoke in the wind. "No," it screamed, the voice now filled with terror. "You cannot do this. You are mine." But the townsfolk pressed forward, their resolve unyielding. The memories they held dear became a shield, a barrier against the dark entity that had sought to consume them. The light grew brighter, illuminating the park with an ethereal glow, chasing away the last remnants of the shadows. With one final, desperate roar, the figure collapsed into a swirl of stars and shadows, dissolving into nothingness. The park was engulfed in a bright light, and as it faded, the townsfolk found themselves standing together, breathless but unbroken. Silence enveloped them, the haunting music gone, the oppressive darkness lifted. David looked around, disbelief flooding through him as he registered their victory. "We did it," he breathed, turning to the girl beside him. "We fought back." She smiled through her tears, the weight of fear lifted from her shoulders. "We remembered them for who they were." As the moonlight bathed the park in a soft glow, the townsfolk began to embrace one another, the bonds of community forged in the fires of their shared grief. They remembered the joy of their lost loved ones, celebrating the lives they had lived rather than succumbing to sorrow. David felt a renewed sense of hope as he stood among them, the darkness of the midnight parade receding into the shadows. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger, united in love and memory. But as they began to leave the park, a whisper of wind stirred the air, sending a chill down David's spine. He turned back to the now empty space where the parade had once thrived, a shiver of unease creeping in. "Do you think it's really over?" the girl asked quietly, her eyes scanning the darkened park. "I don't know," David admitted, uncertainty creeping into his heart. "But we'll be ready next time." And as they walked home, hand in hand, the stars shone brightly overhead, a reminder that love would always outshine the darkness, guiding them through the night. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.